Good morning, everybody. Welcome out to the Sac Metro at-home worship service. We're excited to have you join us today. We are deep into a great series called Letters from a Trusted Friend. You know, you ever get that letter and you start to read it and you start to sit down and you just start to get settled in and then you really get fixated focused on what your friend is writing you. I mean, obviously a lot of you millennials, that would be a text message, but for some of us that are older, we used to get letters that would actually come in the mail, and it worked pretty great. And we would read these letters, but you start to read the letter, and then about midpoint, everything else kind of starts to zone out, and you're really focused and concentrating on what your friend is saying to you. So here we are in chapter 3 of James, and James is really starting to dive into some meaty topics. Let's jump right in and read. In James chapter 3, starting in verse 1, he tells us this: "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." Now, this is not a preacher's favorite passage. This is a cost that every preacher, everybody who speaks and teaches absolutely needs to weigh and consider before jumping in and just starting to teach whatever they feel like they could teach or want to teach. James, I mean, nobody wants to be judged more strictly, right, from God. Anyway, he goes on and he says, "We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect. Is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take a ship as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boast. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body. It sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and it itself is set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a reckless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue, we praise the Lord our Father, and with it, we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear a fig? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. You know, today's lesson, we're going to talk about taming the tongue. And that's our title today, is Taming the Tongue. You know, this is a great passage of Scripture. This is a deep part of his letter to us. And it's very challenging. Who has never wished that they couldn't take back something they have said? I can remember so many things. One time in particular, I was celebrating a birthday, and the neighbors asked, "What would you like for your birthday?" And I said, Legos. I want Legos. I never got to have Legos. I wanted Legos. So for my birthday, I was so excited, hoping that every package I ripped into was going to be a new pack of Legos, something for me to build. So when it came time to open my presents, I ripped open the wrapping paper, and there was a box of generic Legos. They were not Legos. They were a different brand. Same concept, same thing, but they weren't the brand name Legos. So when I opened it up, I looked at the box, and I kind of just had this disgusted look on my face. I set it aside and I said, those aren't Legos. Well, my friend and my neighbor, he was so hurt. He left my birthday party and he walked home and he was crying in his room. My mom and dad made me go back over and apologize to my neighbor. When I knocked on the door, his mom answered and said, well, that wasn't a very nice thing to do. And I felt terrible. I felt horrible. And I opened up his door and there he was crying in his bedroom. And I had to apologize. And I wish I could have just taken back those words. I wish I could have just, not said the wrong thing. Words are so powerful. They have such a power with them. And this morning, as we look at this message today on taming the tongue, we're going to look at several illustrations that James wrote to us about and helped us. And we're going to kind of look at that as he uses those things to teach us about taming the tongue. My first point is 3 illustrations. The first illustration. The first one involves a horse. And it uses, I used to love riding horses when I lived up on the ranch. They're such a majestic animal. They're so powerful. A 200 plus pound man could sit on its back and it almost acts like you're nothing to it. And it's built specifically to carry you. And it's just so amazing. They're such big animals. Horses can be up to 1,200 pounds. 1,200 pounds of flesh and muscle. Powerful. Just completely powerful. That's my word. Powerful. They're powerful. And, James says that even though it's only a fraction of the size, that you can control the entire horse with this small bit that goes inside of its mouth. And it just kind of uses pressure points to be able to steer and control the entire animal. It's incredible. It's brilliant. You might think, how can you control an animal of that size? You would need something big, but you don't. You just need to have a bit. And there's actually other things other than a bit now that they also use, but all you need is a bit in the mouth and you could turn the animal any which way you want. James says that the tongue is kind of like that. It's very small, but it's very powerful. And it can be effective if used correctly, but it can also lead us in a lot of bad ways. And that's what he goes on. He goes on and says, the second illustration he gives us is this. The second one involves a ship. And, we know a lot about ships these days, but let me tell you about one ship in particular. It's the world's largest ship. It's called the Sea-Wise Giant. It weighs over 657,000 tons. 657,000 tons, okay? It's huge. If you were to take the Empire State Building and you were to take it and lay it down on its side, the Sea-Wise Giant is longer than the entire length of the Empire State Building. It's huge. It can carry a cargo of over 564,000 tons. It's incredible. This thing can carry over 1 million pounds. It's in way in excess of over 1 million pounds. It's huge. When it's fully loaded, the draft is so deep that when you put the load on it, the ship actually sinks 81 feet down into the water. It goes so deep into the water that it actually cannot navigate the English Channel. It has to go around. It's too big. It's too deep. It can't go through it. It's crazy. Take a guess. Take a guess how big a rudder would have to be to steer a floating Empire State Building in the ocean, right? Would you be surprised if I said that the rudder was 5% of the entire weight of the ship? No, you wouldn't be surprised because 5% is not that big of a percentage. And it's got a big, long, heavy ship it's got to steer, right? So it's reasonable to consider that, a rudder could be 5% of that mass. Well, it's not 5%. How about 1%? How about 1%? Would you be surprised if I said that the rudder made up 1% of the mass of that ship? Well, probably not, right? Because, you got to steer that big ship. But no, it's not even 1%. In fact, it's not even a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of the total mass of that ship. The rudder of that ship weighs 230 tons. I mean, I couldn't pick it up. It's a little heavy for me to pick up. But when you're talking about 230 tons versus 657,000 tons, it's just a small, tiny, almost insignificant part of the ship. Comparatively, it's so small, yet that rudder can steer that ship wherever that ship needs to go. Pretty incredible. The third illustration that James uses involves fire, right? Fire is a very powerful force. On November 8th, 2019, here in California, we all stood by and listened to the news reports about this campfire that was burning its way north of Chico. And it burned so rapidly that reports said that it was burning up to 3 football fields a second. That's 300 yards every second that the fire was throwing itself, projecting itself so far ahead of itself that it was catching fire and fire and fire and fire. And it burned so quickly, so rapidly. And the town of Paradise was doomed. It was right in its way, and the people had no escape. It burned over 11,000 homes and structures, and 85 people lost their life that day. They woke up, they had their coffee, they thought it was a day just like every other day. But something tragic happened. The fire spread so quickly they couldn't escape. The fire couldn't escape. And James says that the tongue is like a fire, and it can destroy. It could tear apart. It can raise foundations. The tongue is very small, but it's super powerful. I remember when I was a boy and we were playing with fireworks around the 4th of July, my neighbors taught us how to alter fireworks. They taught us that we could put in vice grips in certain places on the piccolo peats and they would explode, and we could drill little holes in the bottom of the ground bloom flowers and they would take off and fly. And we thought this was the coolest thing. And we experimented and experimented and experimented, and we had a lot of fun. But you know the old saying, it's all fun and games until somebody gets hurt. And we were messing around, lighting those off, and one of those ground bloom flowers landed in a big patch of field that had tall, dry grass. And we ran over there and we tried to stomp it out. But as the fire started to grow, it went this way, and it went that way, and it went that way. And we were in there trying to stomp it. Our hair on our legs got singed, but the fire took off. Luckily, there was no one that was severely hurt, no damage to anything. It was kind of a contained field, so the whole field kind of burned up. But it was quick and it was over pretty quickly. But it burned so fast. I was helpless trying to contain it. And James says that the tongue is like that as well. The tongue, when it starts its path of destruction, it burns so quickly and so rapidly that you cannot contain it. You wish you could take back what you said. It only takes a tiny spark to start a lot of trouble. We could say one thing to one person and it takes off. And the next thing you know, there's a lot of people that are hurt by what you say. 3 illustrations that he gives us. A horse's bit, a ship's rudder, and a little fire. You know, the tongue is small, but it's very powerful. You know, the second thing I want to talk about today are three characteristics. Three characteristics. We're talking about three characteristics of the tongue that we just kind of saw from those illustrations. And we get those same characteristics from this passage. The first characteristic comes from fire that I want to talk about. It comes from fire. You know, fires are uncontrollable. And the tongue oftentimes are completely uncontrollable as well. You know, sometimes I wish that my tongue had a Control-Z function. Or if you're a Mac user, a Command-Z function. That as soon as you type the wrong thing, all you do is hit Command-Z. And whatever was there prior to you typing, it comes back. And it's such a helpful function. Because oftentimes, I'm a terrible typist. I'm even a worse speller. So as I'm trying to type, if you're around me, I'm like, Command-Z, Command-Z. And we keep hitting it back and back and back. You know, and if something doesn't look right, all you have to do is hit Command-Z or Control-Z. And I wish the tongue came with this function. That if I say something that's wrong, if I say something incorrectly, I wish I could just hit Command-Z and everybody would forget that I had done or said the wrong thing. You know, it just magically disappears. Wouldn't it be great if the tongue came with one of those built-in features that you're babbling away, you're shooting off your mouth, you're boasting about something, and then suddenly you realize what you're saying and that you should have never been saying it anyway, and you're starting to feel that guilt. You're starting to say, gosh, you know what? This has gotten a little out of hand. I'm kind of getting carried away here. I wish I could just hit Command-Z or Control-Z and just erase the whole thing. You know, the words that you shouldn't have said somehow became unsaid. That would be an amazing feature. Maybe in heaven, in our 2.0 bodies, God's going to give us that function. But until then, it's not that way. Whatever we say, whatever we do, we can't reverse. It's out there. Things that you say to your wife or your husband, you can't take back. I once was at a marriage workshop, and I heard this incredible illustration by Gordon Ferguson, an incredible man of God. And what he said was, you know, it's like a pillow fight. When you're out there whacking each other with these pillows and those feathers, those old feathers come out of those pillows, you can never put those feathers back inside the pillow. They're just out there. You know, a lot of times we need to weigh our words. We need to understand that we've got to have control of our tongue. Because when you say something, it's out there and it's not going to come back in. You can't put it back. It's like this out of control fire. And James is saying that we've got to be careful. And he's not telling us this as a compliment. He's saying your tongue, the words you say, the words you use, whether you feel justified to say them or not, whether you feel empowered to say them or not, your words, they can do a lot of destruction. They could hurt a lot of people. And we've even seen at times when it's caused people to leave God and leave their church because they've been hurt so badly, so deeply by Christians. James is like, you got to control your tongue. The second characteristic, it also comes from the fire. That fires are far-reaching, right? Recently in California, 3 out of the 4 largest fires in the state's history were burning at the same time. These fires all started small. One of them started with a gender reveal, right? A couple was super excited having a baby, and we're gonna find a really creative way to show everybody what we're having, and boom, it starts a fire, a little spark, completely unintentional, starts one of the state's largest fires in its history. They quickly spread to millions of acres. Once that fire started, you have no idea where it's going to end up. You know, there was an old wartime saying that loose lips sink ships. And what does loose lips sink ships mean? Well, in the context of war, it meant that you don't know who you could be talking to. If you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, or if somebody repeats what you told them that you should have kept quiet and secret, that it could give away the position of one of our allied ships. And the enemy could find that ship and sink it, causing hundreds of casualties, maybe even steering the course of the war. Information that should have been kept silent, that should have been kept secret, the ship could be sunk and hundreds of lives could have been sacrificed. I wonder how many lives have been destroyed by careless words. I wonder how many spiritual lives have been damaged or sacrificed because of someone's careless words. Rumors, how they get started. Gossip, that people are like, well, I can't trust anybody here anymore. Facebook wars, sitting behind the computer, hiding behind it, typing up whatever you want to type, saying whatever you want to say because you can't control your tongue. Gossip perpetrated, people's reputation damaged, trust broken. Loose lips not only sink ships, they can hurt and damage people in a wide variety of ways. All because the tongue can be an uncontrollable fire. The third characteristic comes from the ship's rudder and the horse's bit, right? Something so small. The purpose of the rudder, the purpose of the bit is to be able to guide and steer. It's to be able to give it a mechanism to take it the direction you want it to go. It's to steer, it's to direct, it's to take it where you want to go. What we say has a powerful influence on the course of our lives. And I'm not just talking about the difference between someone who's positive and someone who's negative. I'm not just talking about confessions. There's a lot of truth in what we say and how we say it. But when we speak, we reinforce our own attitudes, right? When we guard our tongues, when we stay and we focus and we try to stay focused on God and we try to build each other up, we try to let no unwholesome talk come out of our mouths, right? It helps to reinforce our attitudes. It helps to give us a positive outlook. Or if we're talking negative about things, we just start feeling negative about life. We start seeing things with this negative perception and perspective. When we speak, others are making judgment about us, about what influences, about which influence decisions that they might be making that might affect us. Words can be very powerful. In Proverbs chapter 18:21, this great passage is there. And in the book of wisdom, it tells us this. It says, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. If you love the power of life and you eat it, you too are going to have life. But if you love the power of death and you go out and speak it, you're going to eat that and you will have that. The tongue is super powerful. So our third point, I know this is going to be very confusing. Our third point is this: 3 more illustrations. What? Who made these points? 3 illustrations, 3 characteristics, and 3 more illustrations? Those are your points, Keith? I know, but hopefully you remember them, because James used a lot of illustrations, and those illustrations were meant to help drive home these points. 3 more illustrations. You're probably thinking, why did you start with illustrations and you came back around to illustrations? Well, we did that because James has 3 more important illustrations that we want to dive into. Let's get into them. The first one, he says that all creatures can be tamed, right? All creatures can be tamed. In other words, they can be brought under control. That humans can have dominion over the creatures of the planet. But, he says, you could go out and tame the lion and the bear. You can go out and tame the birds of the air, but you cannot tame your own tongue. The second illustration he uses, he asks a question. He says, can a fig tree bear olives? Or can a grapevine bear figs? Well, the answer is, of course not. No, a fig tree bears figs and grapevines bear grapes. Well, what a world would this be if you planted an apple tree expecting apples, but instead you got cherries? Or you planted tomatoes and it grew pears. It would be crazy. It would be unexpected. You wouldn't know what you could get. You know, the tree brings forth the fruit in which, according to what kind of tree it is, right? There's an association to it. You know, our words indicate what kind of people we are. The words you use tells the world what kind of person you are. So if you're kind of a negative person that's down all the time and doubts everything and, never has kind words to say about anybody, unfortunately, you're telling the world what kind of person you are. That you are negative, you're pessimistic, you don't have nice things to say about people. But if you're an encourager, if you're a person that builds other people up with your words, that you choose, you make a choice, that I have a choice here. I could say maybe this negative thought that I have, or I could say something to help encourage and build them up, and you choose that. It tells people what kind of person you are. You know, if you're a person that maybe a lot of people don't want to hang around, or if they have a hard time being around you, maybe you should look and listen to what kind of words you use. Are you always critical? Are you always using negative terminology? Do you weigh people down? Because we need encouragement. And the gospel calls us to build one another up with our words, to encourage one another as long as it's called today, to be there to help each other, pray for one another, help each other to be encouraged. You know, Jesus says it like this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. He says, "You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." I'm just going to let Jesus' words sink in there for a minute. Because what he's telling us is, your words tell everybody who you are. You know, and if you're out there trying to say good, but you're living an evil life, or, eventually it's going to come full circle. Your mouth is going to speak of what your heart is full of. Kind words come from a kind heart. Angry words come from an angry heart. Forgiving words of mercy, come from a heart that is understanding forgiveness and what mercy is. The third illustration that James uses here is he asks a question. He asks, can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? He goes on to answer his own question. He says, no, a salt spring produces salt water. A saltwater spring cannot produce fresh water. So if you are out hiking around and you're thirsty and you come upon a spring and you taste it and it's full of salt water, walking to the other side, to the far side of the spring and trying the water there, you're going to get the same result. It's not going to change anything. What you're going to find is that it's salt water too. It's not going to change to fresh water. If you want fresh water, you're going to have to try a different spring. And that brings us to the final point of the day. You must choose. You must choose. Since the tongue is uncontrollable and it speaks from whatever is coming from what's in the heart, we have to make choices. We need to choose a different fruit tree. If you don't like what fruit is being produced in your life, you gotta pick a different fruit tree. You need to choose a different spring. If you don't like the water that's coming up out of it, you gotta choose a different spring. If you need to choose to be a different man, then you got to choose to be a different man. If you don't like the old man, if you don't like the man that's grouchy and angry and negative and just full of pessimism and poison, if you don't like where you're at in life, then you need to find what's good. Get to know who Jesus is. Dive into the Word of God. Learn about Him. Become like Him. That's what the meaning of Christian means. It means Christ-like. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 9 and 10, Paul tells us this: do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Paul's like, look, stop playing this game. Stop being a counterfeit Christian. Stop living this life that's producing bad fruit. Take off the old self and put on the new self. You know, the old sinful nature gets crucified with Jesus Christ. When you are restored and renewed through the waters of baptism, when you make Jesus Lord of your life, you are raised with Him to walk with Him in newness. And that life, the life that God has called us to be a part of. So your tree can bear good fruit. The old man is a polluted spring, and it can only bring what it produces: death and nastiness. But the new man is made in the image of Jesus, and it speaks life to the world. It's your choice. You don't have to live with the old self anymore. I want to close out with a thought from Jesus and a prayer from a psalm. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 36 and 37, Jesus tells us this. He says, But I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word that they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. In Psalm 141, verse 3, we're going to read this prayer. Set a guard over my mouth, Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Brothers and sisters, our friend James is calling us and teaching us deeply that now we need to watch and keep a tight rein on our tongue. And we need to protect the words that we say. Take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Run it through a filter before we speak. Understand that our words can be destructive, that they can spread out of control like a wildfire. And they can also guide and steer our course of life. The tongue may be small, but the tongue is powerful. To God be the glory. Amen.